Alright, YouTube, I'd like to talk about traditional marriage, which is something we've been hearing a lot about lately. Something which has cropped up from time to time. Anytime a state legalizes gay marriage, anytime they legalize civil unions, anytime a politician comes out and says, look, I'm gay, or, I'm gay friendly. The idea of traditional marriage, as it's laid forth by the Christian evangelical movement, number one, doesn't really exist, and number two is basically just a cop-out using roughly the same terminology and excuses that were used for slavery and for segregation. The idea that somehow it's correct to discriminate against a minority group on the basis of tradition, not on the basis of actual true secular law. Of course, taking marriage as a state definition, well, if it's a state definition, it can be changed, and that follows because we have a changeable secular government. And if it's a religious definition, then you're automatically violating the First Amendment because there are plenty of religious people in the country that would like to practice polygamy, gay marriage, and so forth. There are still Greek pagans to this day. So let's look at the tradition of marriage. I had a Christian literally yesterday try to convince me that marriage didn't exist until the Bible was written, and that the Jews invented it. It's really rather sad that people who think on this very low, crude level are even allowed to vote. It really makes me fear for the future. Actually, marriage goes back long before any part of the Bible was written. Marriages were already being performed by the ancient pagans, and in many cases were totally different from the marriage systems that we have today. Marriage as a state contract rooted in Judaism. The idea of the traditional mode of marriage, one man, one woman, man is dominant and superior, that goes back to the Old Testament of the Bible, is really no different from saying that women are property. The idea, literally, the Bible says that if you're not a virgin, if a woman's not a virgin when she's married, she'll be killed. The reason for this is not coincidental. The reason for this, and it's still practiced in Jewish culture today very much the same, women were seen as a belonging, as property, as something to be acquired by men, and which had to remain unstained because, of course, if your wife wasn't a virgin and then gave birth shortly thereafter, well, she could have cheated on you before you got married, and it could be someone else's child. That would be your firstborn. You wanted to leave it to a genetically related offspring for property purposes. It's all about property. Of course, in many cultures, marriage is about property. I look at marriage and I say, for all intents and purposes, we should just do away with the institution altogether. If people want to call themselves married and get married at a religious institution, they should be able to do so in whatever form they want, whether it's polygamous, gay union, straight union, whatever. I don't believe the state should even federally recognize marriage anymore. I mean, it's an antiquated system which has no real value. It's obviously not sanctified since more than half of the men in divorce anyway, so what's the point? It's predominantly to get money and to control the population. Well, let's look at the traditional notion of marriage. Let's look at the Native Americans. In Native American culture, they have something called the Berdaschi tradition. And that tradition was, and this is common across many different groups within Native American culture, not just certain groups. Males would act as homosexual cross-dressers. They were considered spiritually enlightened, and at a young age they would realize they were different. They would start dressing as women, functioning as women. The Native Americans had no problem with this. They considered them blessed. They would enter into essentially what equates to a gay marriage with another man, operating as fully functional females. They couldn't have children, but they were essentially their shaman. It was considered blessed. Look at African tradition. This is common mainly in the Islamic part of Africa, although I believe it's also practiced elsewhere. The idea of a Tariya friendship. The idea that a young warrior, whatever, would get together with an older woman who's postmenopausal. They would have sexual relations so they could abstain from the sin of being outside of that contract. they're technically married, but the understanding is he's sort of waiting for a younger female to bear his children, and in the meantime he's just sort of fooling around with this woman who can't get pregnant. And that's common across these cultures. It's a form of marriage, or it's a form of union. Really, the idea of a traditional marriage, we should be talking about traditional unions, because marriage is just one of many forms of union for sexual or property or relationship-based purposes, whether it be romantic or not, whether it be sexual or not. It's just one of many forms of union. The fact that the singular word is used just shows that this particular culture puts more emphasis on the Judeo-Christian definition of this particular acceptable union. I would note that in ancient Greece, being bisexual was considered the norm, and most males had other male counterparts which they frequently had sex with. This was also common in Rome, although the Romans, once Christianity took hold, began to develop certain rules against it. During the pagan times, it was a little more accepted. There was an entire culture on the island of Lesbos where the word lesbian comes from, where women would get married together and sleep together and fuck each other, and men were predominantly there just to procreate, and they preferred lesbian sex. You see, there are all of these different cultures with totally different ideas of marriage. Then there's, of course, the progenitorial Mormons believed in polygamy. One man would have many wives. They don't practice it today because they whitewashed themselves in order to be more in keeping with the government so that they wouldn't get in trouble. But progenitorially, Joseph Smith was a polygamist. These people were polygamists. Islam, in some cases, is polygamous. There are certain Muslim cultures that don't actually practice it, but the Sunni Muslims do indeed smile upon the idea that if you're a man of any means, and if your first wife is willing to deal with you having another wife, you can have up to 4 wives. Of course, Muhammad had more than that, which is a form of hypocrisy, but they never quite explain that adequately. So you see, the idea of traditional marriage doesn't exist. There's no singular definition for marriage. Anyone who's studied anthropology and who's studied these different cultures understands that fact. The problem with the population is that you have people who were raised and the only book that they read was the Bible. They're semi-illiterate anyway, and all of their truth comes from this one Bible, which they assume is historically accurate, though it is not, and that's where they get their ideas from. The fact is that there is no single traditional marriage. The argument that's used to support that notion is literally no different than the arguments that were used to support slavery or segregation. It's an American tradition. Our morals will fall apart if we don't have this singular definition. You know, if we make black people citizens, by God, the country will fall apart. If we allow gays to marry, by God, the country will fall apart. Do you see the similarity here? It's a minority group being deprived of certain rights simply on the basis of tradition, because a bunch of Bible thumpers want to co-opt religion to use it as an excuse for their bigotry. The Bible isn't really even explicit on the issue. What if a gay couple wanted to get married but didn't intend to have sex? They've never thought of that. There are probably people who are romantically bi or homosexual who are also asexual and would never actually have literal sex. There are people out there who are asexual. So what about their unions? It's not prohibited by the Bible. I'd point out that the progenitorial translation of the term sodomy, which so many Christians point to in Leviticus as the reason why gays shouldn't be allowed to marry or have sex or even exist in this country because we're a Christian nation, actually does not refer to gay sex. It refers to man-boy pedophilia as a form of perversion. It does not reference adult gay sex. That's in the original Hebrew. Of course, the Christians don't read Hebrew, so they don't understand that fact, although you can look it up for yourself and you'll see that it's quite clearly the case. The word used doesn't actually equate to the modern translation of Sodom, or sodomy, or sodomite. They just don't equate to one another. So the Christians don't have a leg to stand on. Their own Bible by virtue of a mistranslation, is used as an excuse for bigotry. What's actually true is that Jesus never talks about gays, never even mentions sodomy, and yet the Christians talk about dispensationalism and talk about how the Old Testament, other than the Ten Commandments, is no longer valid because it's been negated by the existence and sacrifice of Jesus. Well, if that's the case, there's only one other part of the Bible that references gays, and that's Paul's letters. Well, Paul is not Jesus. So you're essentially ignoring what your Savior said for what a latter-day individual said who may or may not have even been a genuine Christian. That's rather sad and shows their stupidity. The fact is, using the Bible as an excuse for bigotry makes you look ignorant. I find it infinitely funny that most atheists that I've met have studied the Bible and Christianity infinitely more than most of the adherents of the religion thereof. It makes me chuckle every time. But no, there's no singular tradition of marriage. It's different around the world. It's different throughout ancient and modern cultures. There are all sorts of forms of union that are considered just as valid as marriage in other cultures, and people don't believe that fact. They haven't studied, human cultures at all. They think National Geographic is about the most historical thing they've ever read, and it's really rather sad. And get this hilarious joke. Those of us who understand that these facts are true and point them out, we're called liberal revisionists. That is, that we're trying to destroy the institution of marriage by revising history, which is also very funny because if they studied history, they'd understand, yes, we can prove that other cultures have had different definitions of acceptable union or marriage. It's just simply true. There's no revision involved. It would be revisionist to say, and here's the last thought, that a lot of Republican evangelicals have come on and said, and it was on Stossel literally yesterday with Pat Buchanan, oh, well, all the great cultures have banned homosexuality. You're ignoring the existence of Greece and Egypt. Those weren't great cultures. Alexander ruled the known world for 20 years, completely ignoring two of the greatest cultures that have ever existed. Also completely ignoring the Sumerians and Babylonians, which had no specific strictures against such relationships, although they didn't have a marriage form based around it. So there's four cultures right there in ancient history that haven't really had a problem with being gay or being gay and married to another gay person. You can look at other cultures and you can make some argument that there were exceptions in their general man-woman rules. Of course, most of the time back then people were actually polygamous. They would have maybe one wife and many concubines, or they'd have just multiple wives. We don't practice that today, but it is a tradition. For most of Christian history up until the late Renaissance, the majority of Christian leaders had multiple wives and or concubines. Should we say that this is a tradition and go back to allowing men to take a bunch of concubines, typically by force, just because, oh, well, she looks good, I'll buy her from her family? That's a tradition. And slavery is an American tradition. I'm sure that all the Christian Bible thumpers would love to go back to that. Only problem is, if it weren't racially based, they'd be the ones being enslaved because they're of lower intelligence. So, no, there's no traditional marriage. And I feel strongly about this issue because really it pisses me off when people use the Bible to justify bigotry. It just doesn't make sense to me. If this Jesus of theirs is so great, why they use it as a gospel of essentially hatred? It really boggles the mind.